Mr. President.
Senator from Texas.
Mr. President, I'm glad to be here on the floor of the Senate with my friend Senator Bob Menendez, asking that the United States Senate advance legislation to establish a National Museum of the American Latino. As a proud Texan, I'm fortunate to have grown up in a state steeped in the contributions of Hispanics and other Latinos. Approximately 40% of our population is composed of Latinos in Texas. But they are not monolithic by any stretch of the imagination, which is another reason why we need a museum to tell their stories. They're the Tejanos, whose roots in the Lone Star State predate our statehood or even Texas independence, as well as those that have immigrated from other states or countries and chosen to call Texas home more recently. From the brave soldiers who fought in the Texas Revolution to the civil rights activists like Cesar Chavez, cultural icons like Selena, and leaders of all types in our communities, generations of Latino Americans have shaped our country as it is today. But as I suggested a moment ago, many Americans simply aren't aware of the vast contributions made by these men and women who have come before us. And one critical way we can right this wrong is by providing a home for their stories in the nation's capital. I've heard somebody suggest, Mr. President, that we don't need a separate museum for different racial groups or ethnic groups and the like, but this is far more important than that, because the story of American Latinos is a story of America itself. Many people simply aren't familiar with the vast contributions they've made. This particular effort has been underway for more than 25 years. Nothing happens very quickly, particularly when it comes to establishing a new museum like this. But we're just 2 steps away. And I hope the Senate can take one big step this afternoon by passing this bipartisan legislation and sending it to the President's desk for his signature. I know there's some of our colleagues who have concerns about the museum location, and I can assure them that Congress will have a voice in the site of this museum. But before construction can begin, congressional committees will be consulted on site selection as laid out in the bill, and I believe a colloquy that will be made part of this record. The Smithsonian Board of Regents, which will select the site, is chaired by the Supreme Court Chief Justice and comprised of multiple members of Congress, including 3 sitting senators and the Vice President. Then the Congress will also need to appropriate funds to supplement the private fundraising that will help finance this museum. But the appropriation requirement will be a de facto ratification or rejection of the site selected by the Smithsonian Board of Regents. So there's going to be a lot of input into that decision. We're not making that decision here today. And I believe there needs to be open lines of communication between members of Congress and the Smithsonian Board of Regents as they undertake this significant project. It's been estimated that if we pass this bill today, the doors to a new museum will not open for at least a decade. So I'm eager to get the process moving. The National Museum of the American Latino will honor and preserve the stories of Latinos throughout American history, so generations can view a more accurate and more complete history of the contributions made by these great Americans. And I hope the Senate will advance this critical legislation today.
Mr. President.
Senator from New Jersey.
Mr. President, I come to the floor today and will shortly ask for unanimous consent on H.R. 2420, the National Museum for the American Latino Act. And let me just thank my colleague, distinguished colleague from Texas, Senator Cornyn. He's been a great partner throughout this entire process, strong advocate, helped us navigate some of the challenges we've had along the way. And I'm also thrilled to be on the floor with Senator Collins, who will shortly make motions on the Women's History Museum, which I strongly support, and I appreciate her support for the American Latino Museum. Today, the Senate stands at the precipice of history. We have before us an opportunity to set in motion a process that will eventually culminate in the establishment of a national museum devoted to the history, struggles, and achievements of Latinos and Latinas in the United States. This is long overdue. Some colleagues say, well, why do we need another museum? Well, it was in 1994 when the Smithsonian Task Force on Latino Issues published its report entitled Willful Neglect, a report acknowledging the institution's own glaring omission of Hispanic history and culture. The report found that, and I quote, "The Smithsonian Institution, the largest museum complex in the world, displays a pattern of willful neglect towards Latinos in the United States. Because of both indigenous roots and Spanish heritage, Latinos predate the British in the United States. They have contributed significantly to every phase and aspect of American history and culture. Yet the institution almost entirely excludes and ignores Latinos in nearly every aspect of its operation. Latinos are absent from positions of power and authority within the institution, which helps to perpetuate the exclusion of Latino history and culture from the museum's collections, exhibitions, and programs," close quote. The report also acknowledges how the Smithsonian's exclusion of Latinos and Latinas has not only harmed Hispanic Americans, but all Americans. As the report says, and I quote, "The failure of the Smithsonian to reflect and respect Hispanic contributions is twice damaging. It denies Latinos their right to feel recognized and valued as part of the country's heritage, and at the same time, it perpetuates among the general population the inaccurate belief that Latinos have contributed little to our country's development or culture, rather than reflecting the multicultural history of the United States," close quote. Now, Mr. President, without treading into politics, I think it's important we acknowledge that this misconception is alive and well today. In recent years, we have heard Hispanic Americans, immigrants, and their families used as scapegoats for every economic ill facing our nation. We have witnessed the rise of nativism and xenophobia. We have seen these hateful statements propel acts of horrific violence, like the tragic El Paso shooting. But we Latinos and Latinas are not invaders. We have been here from the beginning. The oldest city in America, well before Pilgrims in Jamestown, was St. Augustine's, Florida, over 500 years ago. Founded by a gentleman named Pedro Aviles de Menendez. And our stories must be told. Who here does not emerge from the Smithsonian Museum of American History more informed about the many movements that have shaped our country? Who does not emerge from the Museum of the American Indian more aware of Native American history and more appreciative of their cultures? Who does not emerge from the Museum of African American history inspired by the perseverance and the power of our Black community? We all do. The Smithsonian Institution is truly a national treasure. But Mr. President, I am not white or Black or Native American. I am Latino. I am 1 in 5 Americans today. My grandchildren are 1 in 4 school children today. But when we walk through the National Mall, or should I say when anyone walks through the National Mall, no one is inspired by the story of Latinos and Latinas in this country, because that story is not being told. Walk outside these halls and ask someone who Bernardo de Galvez was, the former Spanish governor of Louisiana before Louisiana was a state, who led an all-Spanish division against the British, against Washington, who as they were approaching Washington, and helped in the Revolutionary War. The Congress gave him U.S. citizenship. His portrait was supposed to be hung in the Congress of the United States. So much was the battle that he led. His portrait finally hangs in the Senate Foreign Relations room. Go to Farragut Metro Station and ask the writer who it was named for. David Farragut, a Spanish captain who led during the Civil War on behalf of the Union. Visit a school and ask a child where the first settlers to this country hail from. They won't say in St. Augustine, Florida. I guarantee these questions will go unanswered because the history of the American Latino remains unknown. It has been nearly 30 years since the Smithsonian Task Force on Latino Issues recommended that the institution immediately begin laying, quote, the groundwork needed to assure the establishment of one or more museums portraying the historical, cultural, and artistic achievements of U.S. Hispanics, close quote. 30 years. For nearly 30 years, those words have echoed on empty ears. My friends, that silence and inaction must end today. We Hispanics are not a monolithic community. Our families are as diverse as they come. We are Puerto Rican and Mexican, Cuban and Colombian, Spanish, Salvadoran, and more. We are brown, black, and white, left and right, and everywhere in between. Some of our ancestors settled here long before the dawn of our republic. Others arrived alongside generations of immigrants from around the world searching for freedom and opportunity. Some of us grew up along our southern border in cities and communities born out of blended cultures. Some of us, myself included, are the first-generation Americans. Our parents courageously uprooted their lives and came to this country with no connection at all in order to give their children a brighter future. Indeed, that story of hard work and boundless optimism is the common thread that runs throughout our Latino community, all 60 million of us living in the United States. And I would argue that story is as American as they come. So let us ensure that the story is told right here in the nation's capital where it belongs. Let us pass H.R. 2420, and let us ensure that someday in the near future, Latino and Latina children and other children who walk through our national mall will no longer wonder why the story of their families are missing. I know I cannot wait for the day that I can take my granddaughters to the National Museum of the American Latino. So it's been a long and winding road for this bill, one of which I hope will complete its path today in Congress. This has already been passed by the House of Representatives by voice vote, no opposition. This passed the Rules Committee in a unanimous voice vote. Now, we've been asked to make some changes to accommodate my colleague, the chair of the Energy and Natural Resources Committee. And while I personally do not believe that these changes are fair to the Latino community or required or necessary for the bill, I am committed to making them to pass this bill and finally moving one step closer to the construction of the museum. So, with that, Mr. President, I ask unanimous consent that the Senate proceed to the immediate consideration of calendar number 600, H.R. 2420. I ask unanimous consent that the Murkowski amendment at the desk be agreed to, the bill as amended be considered read a third time and pass, and that the motion to reconsider be considered made and laid upon the table.
Is there objection?
Mr. President,
Senator from Utah.
reserving the right to object, I want to thank my friend and colleague, the senator from New Jersey, for bringing this issue to the floor today. Cultural programs may represent, and do in fact represent, a tiny fraction of all federal spending, but they're magnified many times over by virtue of their symbolic and their substantive impact. Culture is, of course, upstream from politics. It's more important and it's more deserving of more of our attention. For that reason, the Smithsonian Institution is more than just another line item in our federal budget. It's one of the great cultural triumphs of our republic. From the moment of our founding, the United States has faced an almost unique problem in history. How do we turn our huge nation's cultural, religious, ethnic, and regional differences from a potential weakness into a real strength? The way our nation has always achieved this is by creating institutions that unite Americans around shared interests and the mystic chords of collective memory. The Constitution, the Senate itself, our free enterprise economy, our armed forces and public schools, federalism, localism, the First Amendment, and even March Madness all fit this bill. They have the power to harness our individual and community differences to the common good of the whole nation.
Now, the Smithsonian Institution does the exact same thing. It winds all the myriad strands of America's triumphant history into one imperfect but heroic story. Americans of every age, race, creed, and background come to Washington from all over the country to visit the Smithsonian museums. Natural history, American history, air and space, American art, the National Zoo. Within the walls of a Smithsonian museum, just like at the National Gallery of Art or the great memorials that dot this city, there is no us and them. There's only us. And so my objection to the creation of a new Smithsonian museum or series of museums based on group identity, what Theodore Roosevelt called hyphenated Americanism, is not a matter of budgetary or legislative technicalities. It's a matter of national unity and cultural inclusion. Now, we've seen in recent years what happens when we indulge the cultural and identity balkanization of our national community. The so-called critical theory undergirding this movement does not celebrate diversity. It weaponizes diversity. It sharpens all those hyphens into so many knives and daggers. It has turned our college campuses into grievance pageants and loosed Orwellian mobs to cancel anyone daring to express an original thought. Especially at the end of such a fracturing year, Congress should not splinter one of the national institutional cornerstones of our distinct national identity. The Smithsonian Institution should not have an exclusive museum of American Latino history or a museum of women's history or a museum of American men's history or Mormon history or Asian American history or Catholic history. American history is an inclusive story that should unite us. Madam President, the senator from New Jersey is absolutely right that the history of American Latinos is a vital part of America's history. So, of course, is the history of American women who have written more than half of the American story, going all the way back to Plymouth Rock. Their stories are our stories, and they're stories that emphatically should be told by the Smithsonian Institution at the Museum of American History, period. No hyphen. Now, the senator from New Jersey is well aware of my stingy views on federal spending. But if American Latino or American women's history are being underrepresented at the Museum of American History, that is a problem. And that's the problem that we should address here. I'll happily work with him or anyone else to correct those problems, even if it means more money, more exhibits, new floors or wings. I understand what my colleagues are trying to do and why, and I respect what they're trying to do, and I even share their interest in ensuring that these stories are told. But the last thing we need is to further divide an already divided nation with an array of segregated, separate but equal museums for hyphenated identity groups. At this moment in the history of our diverse nation, we need our federal government and the Smithsonian Institution itself to pull us closer together and not further apart. On that basis, Madam President, I object.
Mr. President.
Objection is heard. Senator
Madam
from New
President,
Jersey.
sorry. Madam President, 60 million Latinos in this country who are watching tonight, because this is a much expected moment, Univision, Telemundo, affiliates across the country, national organizations, and others, have been waiting for this moment. A moment that everybody in the Congress of the United States agrees to except for one colleague. The House of Representatives passed this on voice. The Rules Committee passed it on voice in a bipartisan manner. And tonight, one colleague stands in the way, one Republican colleague from Utah stands in the way of the hopes and dreams and aspirations of seeing Americans of Latino descent having their dreams fulfilled in being recognized, just being recognized. Now, the Smithsonian is a collection of museums. Let's be honest with that. Did we need an air and space museum? Do we need a museum of the Native Americans? Did we need an African American museum? I would say yes to all of them, because they are part of the mosaic. They are brought together under the rubric of the single most significant cultural institution in the nation, which is the Smithsonian. I don't know if these arguments were made against the Native Americans. I don't know if these arguments were made against African Americans. But I don't see them as being separate and apart. I see them as part of the collective history mosaic that is coming together under the Smithsonian. More than half of the nation's population are women. Are we to deny them that their history in our country is not being told? It's not. It's beyond Betsy Ross, who I appreciate very much. So this idea, and talk about funding, this bill requires that 50% of all of the funding be coming from private sources. So we will fuel the development of programming as well as the physical structure, as well as all the other elements, by the community and communities who want to see this become a reality. 30 years of willful neglect. Nobody cared, nobody made any effort, nobody did anything about it. And the one chance we have, since this has been a 20-plus year journey to try to make this museum possible, one Republican colleague stands in the way. One Republican colleague stands in the way. It's pretty outrageous. It's pretty outrageous. I yield the floor.
Senator from Utah.
I want to be clear about something. All racial, ethnic, religious groups in America are worthy of celebration, even to the extent of having their own museums. Indeed, many of them already do. In many instances, institutions, museums that are not part of or funded by the federal government in whole or in part. If we had more museums and fewer tweets, America would certainly be better off. This isn't about whether such museums should exist or not. This is about the Smithsonian Institution, which is itself federally funded. I understand that they also raise a significant portion of their money, but there is a brand that comes along with the Smithsonian Institution and a lot of money that's taken from the American people in the form of tax revenue. And so, as a result of that, the Smithsonian Institution has a unique role and responsibility in our culture and as a repository and teller of America's national story. Now, it's absolutely true. African Americans and American Indians have a unique place in that story, in that they were rather uniquely, deliberately, systemically excluded from it. Unlike many other groups, they were persecuted and they were essentially written out of our national story, and even had their own stories virtually erased, not simply by our culture or evolving values, but by that very same government, this same federal government. It's therefore uniquely appropriate that the federal government provide the funding to recover and tell those communities specific stories today, at dedicated museums in the specific context of having been so long excluded from our national community and our national story. Thank you.
Madam President,
Senator from New Jersey.
I just have to say, we have been systemically excluded. We, who founded the oldest city in America before there was a United States of America. We, who ultimately were used as farm workers and discriminated against in the Bracero program. We, who were discriminated against when we voluntarily joined the armed forces of the United States to defend the nation. We have been systematically excluded. Not because this senator says so, but because the Smithsonian itself said so. And yet we are supposed to entrust the willful neglect that has taken place for more than 3 decades, taking place longer, but acknowledged for 3 decades. Oh no, we're somehow not systemically excluded. Believe me, we have been. And the only righteous way to end that exclusion is to pass this bill.
President?
Senator from Utah.
If the Smithsonian Institution, in its report in 1994, in fact acknowledged that it had systematically excluded the stories of any one segment in American society, I struggle to understand why the only response to that has to be a separate, siloed museum. Why not direct them, when telling our national story at the National Museum of American History, to tell that story in there? If we have to expand it, we'll do that. If we have to add more floor space and more staff and more research, let's do that. But the fact that they've identified their own failure over time doesn't mean that they themselves should then get to decide that we have a separate siloed museum. Thank you.
Senator from Maine.
Madam President, before I give my remarks, I want to strongly associate myself with the comments that have been made this evening by my colleagues from Texas and New Jersey, Senator Cornyn and Senator Menendez, in support of a museum